Isaac Newton. We've all heard of him as the discoverer of gravity, but there is something more to him that no one talks about. Officially, Newton is the man who explained why apples fall and planets hold their orbits, who split white light into color and built calculus before the world agreed to call it that. Unofficially, in a room almost no one entered, he spent decades hunting a substance he never found, wrote nearly 1 million words about it in a private code, and told almost no one what he'd concluded. He kept a furnace running for weeks at a stretch. He tasted mercury and wrote down the flavor. He signed some of his most private notebooks with a name that wasn't his own. 2 centuries after his death, when his private papers finally surfaced at auction, the economist who bought and read them first did not call him the father of modern science. He called him the last of the magicians. In 1404, England made it illegal to artificially create gold or silver. The reason was simple. The government wanted control over its supply of precious metals. The law remained in place for nearly 300 years until it was repealed in 1689. Ironically, one of the people who pushed for its repeal was Robert Boyle, one of the founders of modern chemistry, who himself spent his later years trying to achieve the very thing the law had once forbidden, turning other metals into gold. Boyle died in 1691 believing he was close. He left behind a written process and a small quantity of reddish powder, entrusted to his executor, the philosopher John Locke. Newton wrote to Locke almost immediately, saying he already understood the outline of Boyle's process and asked for the recipe and the substance both. Locke sent them. What Newton did with what he received was never recorded. What is recorded is that within roughly a year, his health broke completely. He went through periods of severe insomnia and even accused John Locke of conspiring against him, only to later apologize and blame an illness he never clearly identified. Today, some historians suspect mercury poisoning. Newton had spent years experimenting with mercury, even tasting it and recording what it tasted like. And because he kept detailed notes on almost everything he did, some of those experiments survived in his private shorthand, a system he used to keep his more secret work hidden. This video is sponsored by Just Pray. Just Pray is designed to help build habit of praying. It reminds you when it's time for Salah, and the alarm won't stop until you actually confirm your prayer. It can even verify you're at your prayer mat before dismissing the reminder. The app also tracks your prayers, helps you build consistency, and includes useful Islamic features to support your daily worship. If you're trying to strengthen your Salah, you'll find the link to Just Pray in the description. 5 years later, the Crown appointed Newton as Warden of the Royal Mint, and eventually its master. For the next 3 decades, he prosecuted counterfeiters and others who tried to create or manipulate precious metals illegally. The irony is hard to miss. Newton had spent much of his life studying alchemy, the same pursuit that, not long before, could have made him a criminal. Yet he never seemed to see a contradiction. Newton left behind around 10 million words of notes, letters, and drafts. Nearly 1 million of those were about alchemy, more than he wrote for the Principia, the work that made him famous. This wasn't just a side interest for him. Newton approached alchemy with the same intensity he brought to physics. He read everything he could find, organized it, compared different authors, and carefully tracked their strange terminology. He believed that different alchemists might be describing the same process using different names, and he spent years trying to piece it together. According to his assistant, Newton's furnace sometimes ran for 6 weeks without being allowed to go cold. Newton himself would tend to it at odd hours, despite already being one of the most famous mathematicians alive. His notebooks also contain records of 108 separate occasions when he tasted mercury. For years, he worked with substances like arsenic, lead, and antimony as well, apparently relying on little more than his own judgment and whatever tolerance his body could develop. None of this was written for outsiders. Alchemists often used symbols and coded language to hide their work, and Newton took that secrecy even further. In some of his most private manuscripts, he didn't even sign his own name. Instead, he used the anagram Jehovah Sanctus Unus, one holy God, formed from his own name. It was a striking choice, making his signature seem almost inseparable from the subject he was trying to understand. This secrecy wasn't without reason. Alchemists believed that certain knowledge was not meant to be shared openly, and Newton took that idea seriously. When Robert Boyle published details of an unusual reaction involving mercury and gold, Newton privately urged him to remain silent. Newton feared that revealing a genuine secret could be dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands. It's an interesting contrast. Publicly, Newton demanded evidence and proof. Privately, he believed some knowledge was better kept hidden. Newton's secrecy wasn't limited to his alchemical work. It also affected how he dealt with his own discoveries, especially when it came to who deserved credit. During the plague years in the mid-1660s, Newton worked in isolation at his family home in Woolsthorpe. It was there that he developed his method of calculus, which he called fluxions, along with important ideas about motion and gravity. But he kept most of this work to himself for years. Then, in the 1670s, German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz developed calculus independently and published his work in 1684. Newton didn't immediately respond. But as Leibniz's notation began spreading through Europe, the question of who had invented calculus first became a bitter dispute, one that would damage both men's reputations and become one of the most infamous priority battles in the history of science. In 1711, Leibniz appealed to the Royal Society to settle the dispute. The problem was that Newton was its president. Newton chose the committee that was supposed to investigate the case and quietly influenced its findings. Later, it was discovered that he had even written much of the committee's final report himself, an anonymous report that concluded Newton had developed calculus first and strongly implied that Leibniz had taken the idea from him. Leibniz died in 1716 without ever getting the impartial hearing he had hoped for. Newton lived another decade and never publicly admitted that Leibniz had any claim to the discovery. His feud with Robert Hooke followed much the same pattern. Hooke, who worked at the Royal Society, criticized Newton's early work on light and color in the 1670s. Newton took it badly and largely withdrew from public scientific debate for years. Later, when Hooke claimed that some of his ideas had contributed to Newton's theory of gravity, Newton reportedly went through the Principia and removed most of the references to Hooke. There was a similar story with optics. Newton had spent decades working on light, yet the book remained unpublished until 1704, just 1 year after Hooke died. Whether that timing was deliberate or simply coincidence is still debated. For Newton, alchemy and mathematics were not two separate interests. Both were connected to a much bigger belief he held about the ancient world. He believed that the earliest civilizations had once possessed a true understanding of nature, knowledge given by God to figures such as Prophet Moses and Prophet Solomon. Over time, he believed that knowledge had been distorted by mistranslation and idolatry, leaving only fragments behind for later generations to recover. This idea led Newton to spend nearly 50 years studying the Temple of Solomon. He translated passages from the Hebrew Book of Kings himself and compared them with Ezekiel, the Talmud, and the writings of the historian Josephus. Newton carefully worked out the temple's measurements and proportions because he believed they contained a hidden mathematical key to the structure of the universe. To him, the temple was more than an ancient building. It was scripture, history, and almost a kind of scientific blueprint, all pointing toward knowledge that he believed had been given to Solomon. To Newton, correcting a mistranslated verse and correcting an error in ancient chronology belonged to the same project as correcting an error in the mathematics of planetary motion. The clearest example of how deeply these two sides of Newton were connected can be found in a set of notes he wrote for a planned second edition of the Principia, but never published. Historians call them the classical scholia. Newton wrote them around 1693-1694, not long after the period of illness that followed his experiments with Boyle's red earth. In these notes, Newton tried to show that Pythagoras had understood something remarkably close to the inverse square law of gravity nearly 2,000 years before Newton himself formally derived it. His argument ran through ancient reports of Pythagoras experimenting with vibrating strings, finding that musical harmony depended on simple numerical ratios between string lengths. If sound obeyed a hidden mathematical law, and if the ancients believed that same harmony governed the motion of the planets, the old idea of the music of the spheres, then Pythagoras must have grasped, in some encoded form, that the force between heavenly bodies weakened in exactly the same proportion as a string's pitch changes with its length. Newton did not think this was a poetic comparison. He believed the ancients had genuinely possessed this knowledge and deliberately hidden it, wrapped, in his own words, under religious rites and symbols, taught openly only to initiates and disguised for everyone else, so that the physics of the universe wouldn't be handled carelessly by people unfit to hold it. Over centuries, he argued, the disguise calcified into literal belief. People forgot the myths were codes and began worshipping the code itself, and philosophy decayed slowly into idolatry. On this reading, Newton wasn't inventing a new science from nothing in a Cambridge study. He believed himself the first person in centuries capable of decoding what Pythagoras and a chain of vanished priesthoods had already known and hidden in plain sight. The same obsession with uncovering hidden truth also shaped Newton's theology. In his 30s, he began studying the early history of Christianity with the same intense attention he gave to alchemy and ancient texts. He eventually became convinced that the doctrine of the Trinity was not part of the original Christian teaching, but a later corruption introduced by people who, in his view, had altered parts of the historical record. Newton instead came to believe in one God, with Christ being divine but subordinate to God. This placed him close to the views of Arius, a 4th century Christian theologian whose teachings had been condemned as heresy at the Council of Nicaea more than 1,000 years before Newton was born. In Newton's England, this was more than an unusual religious belief. It could get him into serious trouble. Denying the Trinity could lead to imprisonment, and it could have cost him his position at Cambridge, where becoming a fellow normally required ordination in the Church of England. Newton could not honestly take those vows while believing the doctrine was false. Instead, he quietly secured an exemption through his connections and kept his beliefs private for the rest of his life. He wrote tens of thousands of words defending his position, arguing that passages used to support the Trinity had been altered by later scribes. Most of these writings remained hidden in his private papers and were only discovered centuries later, when his manuscripts were finally brought to light. Newton died in 1727. Cambridge kept his mathematical papers, while the rest were returned to his family. Much of it was simply packed away and forgotten. The papers survived a house fire in 1891, almost by accident. Then, in 1936, one of Newton's descendants needed money and put the entire private archive up for auction at Sotheby's. Over 2 days in July, it was divided into more than 300 lots and sold for around $9,000 in total. The auction received surprisingly little attention. Around the same time, Christie's was selling old master paintings just a few streets away for much larger sums and far more publicity. Most of the people bidding on Newton's papers had little idea what they were actually buying, but 2 buyers understood their importance. John Maynard Keynes acquired Newton's alchemical papers, initially almost by chance, and later spent years tracking down other pieces from dealers. Abraham Yehuda, a scholar from Jerusalem, acquired Newton's theological writings, including his work on chronology, prophecy, and the Temple of Solomon. Keynes spent years studying the papers he had collected. In 1946, at Cambridge's celebration of Newton's 300th birthday, he finally gave his verdict. Newton, he argued, was not simply the great scientific mind who ushered in the Age of Reason. He was something else. The last of the magicians.